BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Hello and welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. I haven't been online for a little bit, or at least I've been online fairly irregularly, and that had to do with the fact that I had a terrible cough and could hardly record. Those of you who listen to me live on Austrian radio may remember that. But that also has to do with the fact that I'm working on a new book, and that is a huge research project. And I find myself sometimes overwhelmed by all the things that are there to be done. But I thought it would be fun if I do a little bonus episode for you, as a New Year's gift, as it were, to my subscribers and to you who are listening and perhaps even watching. And I thought I'd like to share something with you that has been keeping me busy over the last few weeks. I was invited last year, at the end of last year, to give the Spinoza Lecture. It was really an honor and a pleasure to give this lecture and to reflect about what Spinoza's thought and also what enlightened thinking, the great tradition of the Enlightenment, can mean for today. I think that is quite a complex question, by the way. There is no single and glib answer. You may, if you are familiar with my podcast, have already got an idea about some of the elements of the answers that I tried to give. But anyway, it is not just saying, ho ho, we need a new enlightenment. But what was also really touching about going there was that my kind hosts took me to two Spinoza houses, two houses in which Baruch Spinoza had lived. And you got a very good sense of this man's life, this man's conditions. The first Spinoza house in Rijnsburg near The Hague is very touching, but also quite a surreal experience, because by now it's really a little suburban residential neighborhood full of modern houses and kids playing on the street and cars being parked. And then you come to this one 17th century house, very sober, very simple, where Spinoza lived. The second house in The Hague, where he lived and also died, he had a little room in the attic of the house. The house belonged to a painter. It was right next to the red light district. Spinoza was never a wealthy man, and he made do with very little. And also that was very touching to see that. And I think if you're a historian, you're always a little bit of a junkie for documents, for touching the real, for seeing what people saw at the time, for standing on the stones they stood on. Anyway, I am. But what really made me want to share this podcast with you was what I saw in the first Spinoza house in a little exhibition under the rooftop, because the Spinoza had a little library, and that has been reconstructed, and you can see that there, the books that he owned in Latin and in Dutch and in French and in Hebrew. Quite touchingly, he also had a Haggadah, which is a book that religious Jews used for the Passover feast, and that's very much a family feast. And he had been expelled from the Jewish community, but he'd kept this one book that reminded him of his family's celebration. That is, was quite a moving moment. But also in this house was an exhibition about him and books that had been written about Spinoza. And there it was, one of the most obscure and most significant books to be published in the 17th and early 18th centuries, the Dictionnaire, historique and critique by Pierre Bayle. Now, Spinoza did not possess this book because it was published after his death, but he appears in the book, and that is a complex story and a really wonderful story that tells you about the craft of being an historian, the dangers of thinking as you want to think, the dangers of free thinking, and also the organization of knowledge. And those things are really what I want to delve into with you a little bit. The Dictionnaire by Pierre Bayle became a very famous book, although it is today hardly remembered. And that had something to do with the life story of the author, but it had particularly a lot to do with what this book allowed people to do. Pierre Bayle was born in 1647. He died in 1706, and he was born in the south of France, in a French Protestant family. And he died in Rotterdam, and that already tells you something about him because, well, his lifespan meets exactly a period in French history where Protestants had been tolerated. And then Louis XIV decided to throw out the Protestants or force them to convert. And that was a time of great turmoil. That was a time of great misery for a lot of Protestants and their families. Pierre Bayle's own brother was taken to prison and died there. And Pierre Bayle himself, who was a professor of philosophy and generally a scholar, he fled, and he fled to the Netherlands. And there he had the task or the commission from a publisher to rewrite a Jesuit dictionary and to just sort of update it a little bit. Now, why is that important? Well, the Jesuits were really the sort of intellectual shock troops of the Catholic Church. And they had taken it upon themselves to produce dictionaries. And that at the time wasn't just a cataloging task, it was really a creative intellectual task because, well, here we come to organizing knowledge. A dictionary doesn't show you everything that's in the world. A dictionary shows you everything the author thinks you should see about the world in the order that the author thinks you should see it in. And that changes everything. Now, the Jesuits had written a relatively straight dictionary by the standards of its time. It was a time when dictionary writing really became in fashion. It's an old craft in the library, in the cuneiform library of King Ashurbanipal of Babylon. We found dictionaries that were produced there in the 7th century BCE, but really dictionaries took off with printing, with the printing press, and after the Protestant Revolution and with the Enlightenment, and with a growing middle class being hungry for knowledge and hungry for understanding the world and perhaps also for displaying the world as they thought it should be displayed. So Pierre Bayle took over this dictionary project, and what shall we say, he changed it a little. He was a phenomenally learned man, and he got, as part of his payment, books from his publishers. And he writes this dictionary, and, well, you should really see it. It's more than I can tell you. But I will also tell you, for those of you who are not looking at a video, let me just show you a copy of Pierre Bayle's Dictionnaire, and you will see what I mean. I will hold it here, and you see there are huge pages, folio pages, and on the very top, you've got a few lines of writing, and then you get 2 columns of footnotes. Now, what is that all about? Well, Pierre Bayle teaches you to think. What I showed you there, incidentally, was the article about Spinoza, because Spinoza makes it into his dictionary, but only to be angrily refuted. And Pierre Bayle tells you how wrong Spinoza was and how many other philosophers thought that Spinoza was wrong. And the method he uses was really revolutionary, because on the top of each page, there are a few lines of text that are, as it were, the dictionary text that tells you what something is, who someone was, where a place was, what a movement said, etc., in a very dry and rather matter-of-fact definition. But, there are the footnotes. And with every footnote, he delves into controversies and debates among scholars and historians and philosophers, and he quotes them and he pits them one against the other. And so he quotes predecessors of Spinoza's arguments down up to ancient Greece, and he quotes what other people write about him. He quotes theology. He also quotes Spinoza himself at length. And in order to show you how wrong Spinoza was, he writes page after page about Spinoza. And very importantly, not just the official definition, but the whole choir, the whole huge debate that is around it. So you learn, hang on, there isn't just one thing that's true, but there are many ways to approach this. There are many things that are uncertain, many facts that are disputed, many ideas where people think about very differently. So all of a sudden, the world of knowledge explodes in people's faces. Now, two things to be said about this. First of all, why did he bother to disprove Spinoza at such great length? Well, he may have actually disagreed with Spinoza, but there's also certainly a strategy here, because Spinoza, for reasons that we may go into in another podcast that would be fun to do, Spinoza was the most hated philosopher of the 17th and 18th centuries. And you could not get a book published in which you said something nice about Spinoza, in which you professed admiration of Spinoza, in which you said Spinoza was right in saying that God and nature are the same thing, and that therefore God cannot act independently of the laws of nature, and that therefore there is no free will, and there is no such thing as miracles, and prayer is useless, and God is not a historical actor because he is synonymous with nature and therefore nature's laws. And this was a movement that was an argument that was very hard to disprove. So Spinoza his books were burned, he was put on the index pretty much all over Europe, and you could not possibly praise Spinoza, but you could condemn him. You could condemn him in great detail, and by doing so, give people the opportunity to read him in all that detail. So many people in Europe learned about Spinoza's thinking from the Dictionnaire by Pierre Bayle, which ironically wound up in a lot of Jesuit libraries. And in these Jesuit libraries, young men, mostly men back then, would sit and would find all of a sudden that the world is not a simple true and false, that there is not just one truth and many falsehoods, but that there are arguments swirling around, there are disputed things from facts to ideas, and there is a world to be discovered that is much more complex than the idea of one truth and one religious truth suggests to you. Bayle's Dictionnaire was published at the end of the 17th century in 1697. It was re-edited in a much bigger edition in 1702, and it continued being in print over the 18th century. You can find copies very cheaply today in antiquarian book dealers if they're not in very good state, because nobody reads that kind of thing anymore, and it's a fun thing to look at. But you can also find it on the internet, and I very much recommend it because it also gives you a beautiful idea of the way that people saw the world back then. One of the people who would have seen Bayle's Dictionnaire in a library in the early 18th century was a young man by the name of Denis Diderot. Diderot, who was supposed to be a priest, and he came from the provincial town of Langres in the Champagne in northern France, and he came to Paris to learn and to become a priest, but he soon found at least, that, as he said, there was a theater and there were beautiful girls, and he had better things to do than to stick around in a library. But he had discovered Bayle, and he had discovered the art of critical thinking and the art of asking questions and of not being satisfied with answers. And that took him into one of the greatest publishing projects of the 18th century. And as so many things in life, this came about not by design, but more or less by accident. There was a bookseller who looked for an opportunity to make a bit of money. And he asked a German scholar to translate an English dictionary for this booming market of dictionaries and encyclopedias. Chambers' Encyclopedia in 2 volumes. Quite a popular work. And so this bookseller, this author, well, he was supposed to go to work, only he didn't. And the project became a disaster, and the publisher wanted to protect his investment. And so he got some other young guy in to translate this English book for the French market. And that was the young Denis Diderot, who was by then a footloose intellectual in Paris, who was trying to make some money with something, because he would certainly no longer be employed by the church. And back then there weren't a lot of jobs you could do if you weren't willing to work as a theologian or willing to work for the king. The job of being a writer without having family money, that was really not yet invented, and that only became invented with people like Diderot. And so he took it upon himself to translate this little dictionary, this little encyclopedia. Only he had read his Bayle, and he had other friends who were very much in the vanguard of knowledge. And so he thought, well, we can perhaps do something more with this thing than just repeat what he's already said and translate it into French. What about if we enlarge it and don't just take what this man in England wrote, but if we get the best experts in the field to write us articles about their subject of specialization, wouldn't that be a much better dictionary? And he asked that to the bookseller, and the bookseller saw the economic potential of this and told this young man to go on and have a go. So Diderot started working away. He was supported by a young mathematician, Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, very brilliant young man, but they didn't really like each other much. And Diderot also thought that as d'Alembert was already famous as a brilliant mathematician, he had to burnish his own image before the first volume of the Encyclopédie was supposed to appear in 1751. And so he wrote a philosophical book in which he very cheekily suggested that God might not exist and that he might be an illusion that people have invented to maintain power. And, well, that swiftly brought him into prison, and he was kept there for weeks. He was in deep panic that he would never get out, because these were not good times for people who wrote atheist books. And he eventually was only liberated because he was actually the editor of the Encyclopédie. And this was a big publishing project, and a big publishing project meant that it employed lots of printers, lots of paper makers, lots of bookbinders, and it was economically significantly enough for Paris that the editor couldn't languish in prison, and he was let out and allowed to continue with the Encyclopédie, of course, with the warning that he must not do anything naughty. But he did something naughty. They did something naughty. They did something very effective. They were very much a bunch of radicals, a radical in various degrees. You can read their own works that they authored later. The works by Diderot, by his great friend Paul Thierry d'Holbach. I will put the names in the description. Works by Diderot's good friend Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They became enemies later, but then they were really inseparable friends. And works by the great Voltaire, who looked on from on high what these young people were doing, and sometimes meddled, and sometimes in quite malicious ways, because he endangered them while he was having fun. But anyway, this was a band of radical thinkers, and they wanted to get their thinking across. And as Pierre Bayle had already found, under conditions of censorship, you can't just do that. You have to find strategies to work. So one strategy that they employed and that they borrowed from dictionaries like the Encyclopédie and like Pierre Bayle's dictionary, they used what we think is quite normal today, the alphabet as the ordering principle. Now, back then, usually in the 17th, 18th century, if you wrote descriptions of the world and everything in it, you had a hierarchy of importance. And that, of course, started with the church and with the king and with the ruling order, and therefore made this a document of submission under that order. But the alphabet explodes all that. The alphabet means that a priest and a prostitute might find themselves on the same page just because of their linguistic proximity, and that the world is completely thrown into turmoil, into chaos, and a new order emerges. And this new order was an order of usefulness and rationality. The Encyclopédie was not the little book that the publisher Le Breton and Diderot had thought it would become. It became a monster. It became a monster of 17 volumes of text, which took just about a quarter of a century to complete and to be published, together with their illustrations. And there were 11 volumes of illustrations showing you the whole world as it was then understood, but with a special emphasis on the sciences, on things that were useful. And of course, with a more or less subtle strategy to still get across their own viewpoints. I mean, you couldn't write against the aristocracy, but you could write about the bees and the state of the bees and point out that the drones, the male bees who don't collect honey, that the female bees have very little time for them once they've given their contribution to the furtherance of the bee hive. They were simply expelled because they were not productive workers. And anybody who made an inference to that and the aristocracy, that was left to the reader's imagination. But you could also use cross-references to great effect. There is a cross-reference for the Eucharist, which is the Christian ritual in which bread and wine are consumed. And in the Catholic Church, it is said that this is the body and the blood of Christ. And so the cross-reference at the end of this article, slightly cheekily, is see cannibalism. So with these subtle and not so subtle strategies, Diderot and his colleagues and collaborators could actually finish this mammoth project of the Encyclopédie, and that was a real triumph of a rationalist school, because the Jesuits were against it, but also the Jansenists, who were a different Catholic, shall we say, force movement at the time, who were very influential. The King's Court was against it. The secret police was against it. And it was a small miracle that this dictionary this encyclopédie could still appear. Why am I telling you about two old dictionaries? Well, because there were ways of shaping the world anew. There were ways of changing the world. We are used to dictionaries. I mean, if you look at the great 19th century dictionaries that came out, from the Encyclopedia Britannica to its equivalents in all sorts of countries and languages, you will find a very different approach to dictionaries and dictionary writing. Namely, this is no longer people who invite you in to follow a debate or to see something amazing and new. It's not Pierre Bayle's approach of allowing you to listen to the voices of the ages and how different people's thinking was. It's not the Encyclopédie's approach of subverting the world order as it is. In the 19th century, dictionaries are made to show you the order of the world, and the order of the world is very much a white middle class and, yes, capitalist, colonialist, patriarchal order of the world. And these dictionaries become the long read proofs of the fact that this is the only and necessary and moral and scientifically correct order of the social world and the natural world and the political world there can be. So dictionaries become, from an instrument of subversion, they become instruments of power. But of course, today we live in another age again. There are dictionaries like Wikipedia, and with that, Bayle's idea of knowledge as contested terrain is very much back. The articles in Wikipedia are never finished. They are continued debates, and if you look at the hotter articles, the more contentious topics, you see that there are huge debates. And not only that, there are attacks, there are attempts to take over the definition of a word, of a concept. This is very much contested ground. This is very much knowledge that is subject to almost a war of words, and sometimes a real war of words. Now, that is a dangerous thing, but it's also quite a good thing, because it teaches you not to just expect to find a truth that you can believe, but that you have to take these things with caution, with skepticism. You have to look at them for yourself. You have to do your own research. You can never just believe the official truth. And that brings me to the last point in this little series of reflections. We're all that we are doing research or looking at the world or working with words or with numbers, making experience with large language models, with AI, with ChatGPT or DeepSeek or Claude or Perplexity or what all their names are. And they give us a very, very authoritative image of the world. You can ask them what you want, and they produce beautifully detailed, bullet-pointed, structured answers that give you a very convincing idea of what the world is like. And it is more important than ever that we look at this in the same way as contested, uncontestable ground, and not take the official dictionary definition of the great leather-bound tome or its digital equivalent as the truth, but that we keep Bayle's approach to looking at the world through questions, through debates, through argument and counter-argument. These large language models are going to be a very large part of our lives, and they're going to obviate so much work, but also so much expertise, because people will simply no longer try for themselves. And when you stop trying for yourself to understand something, to really build an argument, to really acquire the knowledge and the background and the context to understand the argument, if you stop doing that, you can no longer evaluate whether the answer that you get is valid or accurate or a hallucination or has been manipulated. And here we come to a new age of the organization of knowledge that pits the sheer monumental force of human convenience and laziness against the need to keep an open mind and to keep researching and to keep asking and questioning. That is, I think, a moment at which we find ourselves today. And I just wanted to give you that into the new year. There's so much to discuss, and we will do that, so much political and historical. I'm just about to record another podcast to which I very much look forward that it's going to be more political. You will see it because I'll be wearing the same jumper as I'm wearing now. But let's keep an open mind about the truth. Let's keep an open mind about the information that we get presented and the official truth that's get presented to us, whether it's on the screens on smartphones or in big leather-bound tomes in libraries. They are always somebody's version. They are always in somebody's interest. They always show you something because there is an interest. I have the opportunity, the habit that whenever I see a video on YouTube or so that's entitled "They're Lying to You," I delete it straight away because it's such an extremely stupid way of thinking of the world. Of course, they're lying to you because all information that's out there is interested, is presented by someone in some interest, and Wikipedia may try to nullify this trend, but that is exactly why it has become contested ground. And now there are even rival encyclopedias that give you a very clear ideological slant. But the knowledge that is presented to us by seemingly disinterested actors, such as large language models, may be the most dangerous of all, because it will take over the knowledge sphere. And as long as it is good enough, enough of the time, people will simply start accepting it. The only way of staying a free and thinking person is to keep discussing, keep questioning, keep asking, keep reading long texts which do different stuff with your brain than short tweets can do it. Make yourself do that, put yourself through it. That's how you maintain a head that has a certain degree of independence. And well, perhaps this podcast can help a little. Anyway, it was fun to spend this half hour with you, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you soon again. I hope this podcast is going to grow even more this year. We got more than 1,000 subscribers last year, and we indeed got a few subscribers, and I want to thank them especially. It's good to know that my work has a bit of resonance, but it also really helps me to be able to make these podcasts. And well, I'm looking forward to continuing this dialogue with you. You can also write to me with suggestions, for instance, for guests. I'm always grateful for that, or for topics. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Philip Blom says goodbye and have a great 2026.